Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll just wait for the Zoom room to fill in a little bit and start shortly. Thank you. Well, hello and welcome everyone joining us from South Asia, the United States, and beyond. My name is Akriti Vasudeva Kalyankar, and I'm a fellow here at the Stimson Center and editor-at-large of South Asian Voices, our online policy platform. And I'm very pleased today to welcome you to the second in a two-part webinar series that South Asian Voices has organized, examining China's role in South Asia, particularly in the context of the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, in our webinar in August, which I hope some of you tuned in for, we covered China's strategic role in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And today in our discussion, we will focus on Chinese, Indian, and American engagement with some of the smaller states in South Asia, specifically on Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Now, as I mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's trillion-dollar global infrastructure project, marks a decade this year. And this really is a good and opportune moment to reflect on the local impact of this project and how China's economic, political, social, and foreign policy goals have evolved in this time, both to adjust to the needs of partner countries, but also in response to great power competition in different regions around the world. But today, we're going to be focusing on a region where this dynamic is clearly visible, which is South Asia, where Beijing has attempted to provide economic benefits to countries in a competition for influence, primarily with India and the United States, but other countries as well. So in our conversation today, we will focus, like I said, on Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, but essentially on how they perceive Chinese, Indian, and American engagement in the subcontinent, and what are the broader implications of these interactions for regional stability and prosperity. Our panelists will reflect on their recent contributions for a South Asian Voices series, which looks at local and regional perceptions of Chinese economic and strategic interests in the subcontinent, and especially at prospects for bilateral relations as well as great power rivalry. I'm really excited today because we have a great lineup of speakers to talk about all of these issues and more. And let me introduce them one by one. I'm delighted to be joined first by Kitmina Hevagi, who is a senior development policy advisor. He's currently working with governments, corporates, philanthropists, and nonprofit organizations across 17 Asian economies. And he has extensive experience working on international development issues with a specialization in political economy and foreign policy analysis. And a lot of his work has focused on Sri Lanka. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Shafi Mustafa, who is an associate professor of world religions and culture at the University of Dhaka. His research interests include political Islam, authoritarianism, modern South Asian history and politics, and international relations. And he contributes articles on Bangladeshi politics, religion, minority rights, human rights, and secularism. Next, we go to Gaurav Thapa, who is an international relations analyst. He's an executive member of the Nepal Council of World Affairs and also president of the Nepal Forum of International Relations Studies. His key areas of research interest include foreign policy and diplomatic history of Nepal, Nepal's foreign policy vis-a-vis India, China, and the United States, obviously very relevant to our discussion today, and the geopolitics of South Asia. Next, we have with us Kalpit Mankekar, who is a fellow with the Strategic Studies program at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. And his research focuses primarily on China and its rise and domestic politics within the country as well. And last but certainly not least is Nilanthi Samranayake, who is a visiting expert with the South Asia program at the United States Institute of Peace, and also an adjunct fellow at the East-West Center in Washington. She has 25 years of experience in the nonprofit research sector, and her work focuses on regional security in the Indian Ocean, smaller South Asian countries, non-traditional security issues, and US alliances and partnerships. And she just returned from a trip to the region, specifically to Maldives and Sri Lanka, so I hope you'll hear a little bit about her insights from those conversations as well. Now, this discussion will be a mix of a moderated discussion between the panelists and I, and plenty of audience engagement. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please do submit your queries via the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be interspersing the questions from the audience throughout the session. So please do send in any queries that you have. Now, we'll say we only have an hour and 15 minutes, and we have a lot to discuss, so I'd ask the speakers to please keep their responses to 2 to 3 minutes maximum so we can get to as many questions and have as much back and forth as possible. Now, with that context, maybe let us start with sort of a broad overview of the state of play in the region. And let me start with a question to first to Gaurav, Shafi, and Kitmina. How would you characterize the nature of Nepali, Bangladeshi, and Sri Lankan engagement with China's BRI since the initiation of the project? And could you maybe highlight any changes or continuities in each country's stance during this time? Gaurav, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Shafi and then Kitmina.
Okay, thank you, Akriti. Thank you for providing this opportunity today. Nepal's engagement with China on BRI. Nepal was a signatory since 2017. Initially, Nepal started with proposed 35 projects, but later those were trimmed down to 9 projects. But even in these 6 years, the progress has been almost negligible. And some of the projects that have been earmarked for this under the BRI, some feasibility studies for certain projects have been undertaken, but on a whole, most of the projects are still stagnant and there has virtually been no progress. So during the visit of Prime Minister Prachanda earlier in September, the broad gamut of relations were discussed, and obviously BRI was a big part of that. And both the sides, both China and Nepal, have agreed to so expedite to accelerate finalizing of the BRI implementation plan. So they have reviewed the progress, and since the projects, and the most important project that has been highlight of this BRI project with China has been the cross-border railway link, which obviously is a huge project. Because it encompasses building connectivity via the Himalayas, which is really difficult geologically also, geographically also, as well as financially also. So Nepal has put priority to this project. But having said this, progress has in all the projects that have been earmarked or that have been finalized have been very slow. Thank you.
Thanks, Gaurav. And I have a few follow-up questions with you after this round, but Shafi, maybe we'll come to you on Bangladesh's engagement with China.
Oh, well, let me begin my talk with 2 statements. Definitely, because these issues will come up later, I know, but let me just give a footnote on that. That Bangladesh's stated foreign policy is plain and clear, that friendship to all, malice to none. And the second thing is the Bangladesh's foreign minister clearly said that China has come up with the baskets of money. So you can clearly understand. And why I am saying this, the baskets of money, it has the implications for Bangladesh's the current political goal, domestic political goal. So nearly Bangladesh is expecting to receive nearly $40 billion under this BRI project. And since the introduction of BRI, Bangladesh's policy is a little bit shifting towards China, and there are a lot of issues. Maybe later we can discuss those issues. But so far, recently, 2 mega projects under BRI, I would say, that is inaugurated, maybe just this month, I think. One is the Kondofuli River Tunnel. This is one of the mega projects in Bangladesh. And also the Padma Bridge railway link project that is also inaugurated this month. And this mega project has a big implications for Bangladesh's domestic politics at the moment. So nearly $10 billion already Bangladesh has received $10 billion under that BRI infrastructure project. And Bangladesh is also expecting many more to come because of its current economic situation. And that is one of the point that why Bangladesh is tilting more towards China, not towards India, and obviously not to the US. So we will discuss those issues later. Yeah.
Absolutely. Certainly, we'll come to that, and also to the linkages between domestic politics and foreign policy as well. But Kitman, over to you on kind of Sri Lanka's evolving stance on the BRI.
Thanks, Akriti, and thank you to the Stimson Center for inviting me. So Sri Lanka's relationship with the BRI, in fact, begins before the BRI is officially inaugurated 10 years ago, particularly towards the end of the war in the late 2000s. Sri Lanka becomes somewhat politically ostracized from its traditional development finance partners because of alleged war crimes and other political issues. But also, I think, and more importantly, Sri Lanka, after graduating to middle income status, doesn't qualify for concessionary loans as much as it did before, which means that it had to find an alternative means of finance, particularly for its post-war development. So in 2009, the war ends, and then the government at the time looks for alternatives because concessionary loans were not available. And that's where kind of the BRI, or the initial version of it, starts to step in. And pretty much the BRI aligns well with the government's strategy of pursuing debt-led growth, and particularly by investing heavily into large infrastructure projects. And the BRI kind of fell into that scope. And as a result, it provided that sort of development finance. And that is why the BRI is kind of synonymous with some of the big infrastructure projects at the time, like the Hambantota Airport, the port, the Lotus Tower, etc. Now, I know the narrative is that Sri Lanka's economic crisis is because of China, but that is wrong. Sri Lanka's economic crisis is not because of the BRI or Chinese loans, but the BRI, what has happened is that the BRI is a symptom of a lot of the domestic economic and political decisions that were made at the time that contributed to the economic crisis. So that is why it's synonymous with kind of the debt issues that Sri Lanka is now facing. In terms of the kind of the evolution of it, and I'm sure we'll go into more detail later, basically what the BRI is now, there is no more scope for large infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka because of its current economic conditions. But rather where I think the BRI will play a role, and Chinese investments will play a role, is one, in terms of the debt restructure, because China will play an important role in that, but also in terms of Chinese investment into some of the economic areas and sectors that the government is trying to privatize. So, for example, in the petrol distribution, in electricity and solar energy, and then kind of other sectors as well, where the government is trying to move on from state monopolies. So there is that opening up of certain sectors that I think China sees an opportunity, but also other players like India and the US are also seeing opportunities in those sectors as well to invest. So I think BRI is, as we see this evolution, is going to turn from kind of a more infrastructure-focused infrastructure finance project to more kind of investment and private investment in other areas as we move ahead. But that is driven mainly because of Sri Lanka's current economic needs and requirements.
Thanks, Kitman. And we'll come back to that question of debt restructuring. But Gaurav, let me ask you a follow-up on the comments that you made. You mentioned that Nepal signed on to the BRI in 2017. But, again, as you mentioned, projects have not actualized in this time, and differences have emerged between Kathmandu and Beijing, particularly on funding modalities, where China wants to provide loans, but Nepal is looking more for grant assistance. But how much leverage does Kathmandu have in pushing Beijing to accept its demands, considering, the trade imbalance between the two countries and the fact that Nepal actually does need infrastructure development and connectivity? And so maybe if you could respond to that, and how much do Nepal's relations with India and the US factor into this calculation?
Yeah, thank you, Agrit, for the question. As we all know that we are more the geographically Nepal is the ease of access to the sea is easy via India, and with the China we've got the whole 1,400 kilometer long Himalayan belt. So to mitigate this problem, or to have another point of connectivity, both the governments have tried to sort of initiate this mega project of the Trans-Himalayan under the Trans-Himalayan multidimensional connectivity. So this railway project is supposed to be the game changer. But as you rightly said, the Nepali government and at the moment Nepali economy is also not doing that well. So considering all the factors, Nepal has always preferred grants rather than taking loans. And for this mega project, and BRI, the model of BRI is, as we all know, it's not a grant-based model. It is a mutually beneficial sort of a thing where China is providing soft loans. So the main concern regarding the governments, or you might say the main crux where it is the hindering factor has been in the funding modality. And even during the Prime Minister's visit, I'm sure that this must have come up. So they've decided to, the feasibility studies is going on, but they're planning to upgrade it. And with India also, we have our connectivity with India is along the contiguous border. It is it's an open border, so we have ease of access to the sea. So even though if we have the connectivity with China, our trade mostly will be through India, because the nearest seaport is quite, the Calcutta port, or you can say the Visakhapatnam port, will be crucial still, but Nepal will have another dimension of having access to the sea.
Great, and we'll come back a bit more to Nepal's interaction with India and the US a little later in the conversation. But let me come to you, Shafi, and like I said, I did have a follow-up for you as well. Maybe, and you mentioned this in the piece that you wrote for South Asian Voices, but can you maybe talk a little bit about what has motivated the significant uptick in Dhaka's defense and economic relations with China over the last 5 years? And I ask this especially because, this was preceded by a period of largely positive relations between Bangladesh and India, and also the US and Bangladesh. We did see a lot of engagement and interaction between the two countries under the Trump administration, for example. So maybe just talk us through what has changed in the last few years and in the interaction of Dhaka with the US and in India.
Oh, well, in last 5 years, actually, the main transformation has happened in China-Bangladesh relations in last 5 years, especially after the visit of Chinese Prime Minister, maybe back in 2017. We know about that the BRI project in 2013, and then the Chinese Prime Minister's visit in 2017. And after that, actually, then Bangladesh started deepening its relations with China. Having said that, why I'm saying there's deepening relations, historically Bangladesh maintains a very good relations with India because of India's role in the Bangladesh's liberation war, and Bangladesh's whole security mechanism and the bilateral relations is almost is dependent on USA and India. But all of a sudden, because Bangladesh is slowly becoming a more a type of authoritarian in its governance system. And a relationship with USA, it started declining from that perspective. So, and as Bangladesh's legitimacy, current government's legitimacy, it depends a bit on its development, populist development strategy. So it requires a lot of money, pumping money from outside. So that's why it went to China, it went to Russia, it doesn't matter, but they need money, immediate money. So that purpose was solved, I would say, solved by the China and Russia. So that's why Bangladesh was desperately looking for money, and they received that soft loans from this country. So that's why they take initiative of, the World Bank withdrew its funding from Padma Videos in 2012, and that was a very suffocating situation for this regime in 2012, because the World Bank said there is a corruption. So in anticipating of big corruption, they withdrew funding from that project. And at that point, Bangladesh started looking for money from elsewhere, not from the World Bank. And this is how the shift has been happened. And especially Bangladesh has also, there is a submarine base that cost nearly over $1 billion. They bought submarines from. They established a submarine base in Cox's Bazar, and that is very. Geographically, that region is very important for the whole, for the USA, for the India, and definitely uh, is still building relationships with China, but it does not mean that it does not have any connections so far. It doesn't have connections with India, because without India, we are surrounded by India. We're in the stomach of the Indian. So we're surrounded on the three sides by the India, and just on the other side, one side is open. That is the Bay of Bengal. So our foreign policy, we cannot think without India's engagement here in Bangladesh. Yeah, that's my take. Yeah.
Shafi. And Kalpit and Nilanti, I'll bring you in more on, US and Indian assessments of China's security role, particularly in the region. But Kitman, let me come to you on the follow-up that I wanted to ask. So, in your piece for the SAV series, you mentioned that China was reticent to support the Rajapaksa government during the economic crisis. But I think I just wanted to understand what explains this Chinese reticence to bailing out Colombo when, Beijing has actually responded to financial distress in other BRI countries, right? So if you look at the study that was conducted by A-Data, the World Bank, Harvard Kennedy School, and the Kiel Institute, China actually granted rescue loans of about $104 billion between 2019 and 2021 to BRI countries. So could you talk us through a little bit of that dynamic?
Sure. It's fundamentally a calculation by China that the Sri Lankan government under Gotabaya Rajapaksa was an unreliable partner, both in terms of economics, but also politics. So on the economic side, continuously the government was making decisions that made it obvious that we were going to go into kind of an economic crisis, with the tax cuts followed by excessive money printing, and then forex tightening, kind of the fixed forex exchange rate, etc. And so anyone with a basic econ degree could see could read the tea leaves, so to speak, and understand that Sri Lanka was heading towards crisis. So it kind of economically didn't make sense. But what is important to note is that China did offer sort of a out by offering forex money exchange, but on the condition that Sri Lanka improves its foreign reserves significantly more than what it was. So I think at the time it was around less than 1 month's exports. At the time, I think the condition was it needed to go up to at least 3 months or 4 months of exports, which was, to me, code to say, go to the IMF, right? And then there were a lot of calls at the time to say, go to the IMF, get a package, let's resolve this, and then stabilize the economy, and then figure it out. And this was in 2021, so late 2021. But the government was insistent that they didn't want to go to the IMF. They kind of had this local, homegrown solutions rhetoric, right? So as a result, it economically didn't make sense. And also, I think it's also important to recognize what the Chinese economy was like in 2021. And it was at a kind of a sensitive position, which meant that they couldn't afford a country like Sri Lanka to go bankrupt on its accounts and after giving money. On the political side, so at the same time, on the political side, there were quite a few kind of, I would say, pretty much amateurish foreign policy decisions that were made, which also annoyed China and then made it clear that they were Sri Lankan government weren't reliable partners. So things like, the government gives a solar power project in the north of the country, and then withdraws it when India puts pressure on it. And this was all playing out publicly. Then you have the kind of the fertilizer shipment fiasco, where kind of the regulators rejected it, and it was quite a public humiliation, in fact, to China at the time. You also had kind of the research vessel saying yes to it, then no to it, yes to it again. And also Sri Lanka gave a oil refinery project to a US government. And this was all happening around the same time, which meant that the Sri Lankan government was also sending mixed signals to China about whether it saw China as a partner or not. And I think underpinning all of this is that once the protests started, China obviously made the political decision that they didn't want to be linked to an extremely unpopular government. They didn't want to be seen as propping up an unpopular government. And that's, I think, so in combination of these economic factors, together with the political factors, I think that was the calculation that China made, that it didn't make sense to kind of overtly go out of the way to kind of bail out Sri Lanka, so to speak, particularly because it had given that option of Sri Lanka figuring it out by improving its foreign reserves. And there was a pot of money there to be taken had the reforms kicked in a lot earlier.
Thanks, Gitman. And a really interesting conversation so far. I want to encourage everyone who's joining to send us your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But let's bring in the discussion on U.S. and Indian involvement in the region. So let me come to you, Kalpit and Nilanthi. And maybe, start with kind of talking about what have been India and the United States foreign policy objectives in South Asia in the last 10 years, particularly in the context of increasing Chinese role in the region in the security and economic space. And how have these goals and actions, evolved over time? What have perhaps been the lessons learned from this engagement that we will see play out in the next few years? Kalpit, I'll come to you first and then Nilanthi.
Yeah, hi. Delighted to be here, and thank you so much to the Stimson Center. Now, I'll try to summarize the last 10 years in, maybe brief 3 or 4 points. Now, firstly, post 2014, there has been a very different outlook, foreign policy outlook, particularly in Delhi. It started with the whole outreach towards, the heads of states of, the countries surrounding India. So in 2014, we saw those visuals of all the heads of state invited to the swearing of Prime Minister Modi. Now, this interaction has been cemented by a sort of a neighborhood first policy where I think primarily there was, a lot of visits were swapped. So Prime Minister Modi visited, during his first 3 years, he visited almost all the countries in the neighborhood. In fact, if I'm not wrong, no prime minister had visited Nepal in about 2 decades, and Prime Minister Modi went there, and there was a very different dynamic to that relationship. Learning from BRI and connectivity, India really took these baby steps towards connectivity. So you saw a kind of a motor vehicle agreement in which vehicles could travel. There was cross-border connectivity of vehicles. Also, I think we have to understand the the economic dynamics that has played out in the last, decade, where 2013, Indian economy was in a poor state. Now, in the last 10 years, from that nadir, it has gone to being the fifth largest economy in the world. And this has also meant that there is greater latitude for India to kind of be developmental partners of its neighboring countries, helping out with grants, with loans, and also with technical consultancies. The another thing has been that it has become a troubleshooter in the region, specifically in terms of natural disasters, in terms of maritime disasters, and also giving assistance to neighboring nations. So I think there has been a great deal of evolution in the last few years, where the Indian economy has changed, and so has India's latitude towards making developmental pledges to neighboring countries. Yeah.
Nilanthi?
Sure. Thanks, Akriti, for having me here today. I'll share some of my personal views. I have 3 points on this question. I think first we can understand U.S. foreign policy objectives in South Asia by looking back to 2013 versus where we are now, 10 years later. So in 2013, the U.S. had wartime objectives regarding Afghanistan and Pakistan, just trying to withdraw from the conflict. With India, the U.S. had made significant gains in the strategic relationship with India. This was under the Manmohan Singh Congress Party leadership, though. So there were certainly some historic breakthroughs, but not quite the defense and security level of ties that we have since seen under the BJP leadership. For example, we hadn't yet seen the major defense foundational agreements signed, like the Lamoa, the Comcasa, the Becca, and the Malabar exercise had been reduced in scope. So you contrast that to now in 2023, the US has pulled out of Afghanistan. It's now providing wartime support to Ukraine in its war. So it's been pulled outside the region for combat support purposes. And with India, those defense foundational agreements have been signed. The Malabar exercise has been made more complex, and there's more partners. US naval ships are being repaired in India. The Quad has experienced significant gains, and there are a lot of more items along that vein. And I think those developments have been aided by a worsened China context for India. China established its first ever military base overseas in Djibouti. In 2017, we saw the Doklam standoff, where India actually sent troops to assist Bhutan as a smaller South Asian country, and also the border conflict that we've seen between China and India since 2020. Also, China has been just more assertive generally in the waters of the Pacific, which has also been an important signal. And then it's been 10 years of BRI branded activities. So there are some big structural changes that have also affected US policy in South Asia. Second, I think we can say that officially there is more attention to the smaller South Asian countries because there is a new Deputy Assistant Secretary of State that is responsible for these countries. And that, of course, has coincided with the establishment of a Deputy Assistant Secretary for India. However, there is no mention of the smaller South Asian countries in the Indo-Pacific strategy. And this is a significant omission, and one that I think actually belies US policy focus that actually does exist in these countries, although they're clearly secondary to the US strategic focus on India and supporting its leadership in the region. And I think this is a gap that can be addressed in the next iteration of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And then third, I think we can see, with regard to US policy towards some of the smaller South Asian countries, certainly some differences between now and 10 years ago, but also some continuity, particularly in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And I'll pause there.
Thanks, Nilanthi. And we'll come back to kind of that US-India cooperation, or perhaps differences in the way that they approach the region. But I wanted to go back to Kitmina, Gaurav, and Shafi, because we have a lot of conversation in DC, for example, about about the Indo-Pacific strategy, about China's role in the region. But I think we don't center as much the perspectives from the region, particularly from the smaller countries and the agency that they have in the decisions that they want to make and sort of areas that they would like to invite cooperation in. So, from that angle, I wanted to ask, maybe we'll go to Kitmina first and then Shafi and Gaurav. What are the priority areas of economy and defense for, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, where each country is seeking foreign assistance? And in which of these areas are China, India, and the US, most likely to plug in or, succeed or fail? So we'll go to you, Kitmina, first, and then Shafi, and then Gaurav.
Sure. I think, as I said earlier, in terms of the economy, the areas of interest and the areas of requiring international assistance are pretty obvious. And the main one is the debt restructure. The government has agreed with the IMF there's a framework in place, but that heavily depends on the debt restructure with private lenders, but also importantly with bilateral lenders. And so that's where I think China plays a very important role, as does India, because those are the two big bilateral lenders to Sri Lanka. And of course, the Paris Club plays a role in terms of kind of broader debt. So that in terms of kind of navigating that relationship is going to be the most important in the immediate future, and ensuring that China agrees to a debt restructure that India will be happy with as well. And India has insisted that any agreement that Sri Lanka comes with China, that India has to be treated as equal partners. So it has to be the same agreement. So I think that's going to be one of the key factors. The second is in terms of investment, and particularly Sri Lanka is open to investment from abroad, particularly in things like utilities, fuel, insurance, etc. There are some sectors that the government has established, that has identified. And I think India, China, the US, and other European economies as well are kind of looking at opportunities to come in. Where I think Sri Lanka will be most kind of concerned is to kind of seek defense support, because it's almost a lose-lose situation if it aligns with one, because the other then will see it as too much of an alignment. And then, for example, we saw towards the end of the previous, when current President Ranil Wickremesinghe was Prime Minister, so towards 2018, when the US government was trying to push the SOFA agreement, the status of force agreement with Sri Lanka, there was a massive political backlash, but also concerns from China in regards to what Sri Lanka was trying to do. So similarly, when it comes to research ships coming to Sri Lanka, there is then kind of a pushback from India about what the causes are. So in terms of defense assistance, there will obviously be kind of more multilateral assistance that will be seen in terms of piracy and kind of maritime security, etc. But bilateral defense assistance is one of those areas that I think Sri Lanka will be sensitive to, and will try to kind of hold the hands-off approach wherever possible, so that it doesn't kind of doesn't anger one party over the other.
Thanks, Kitman. And we're already getting a lot of great questions, which we'll get to in a minute. But Shafi, same question to you from Bangladesh's point of view.
Well, I don't think Bangladesh is too much worried or concerned about its defense or security mechanism. Rather, Bangladesh considers defense cooperation as part of its development strategy. As this mega project development is connected with the current regime's legitimacy. Having said this, China is likely to continue its success in areas of infrastructure, trade, technology, and defense, where it has already made significant or substantial inroads. Its extensive financial resources and experiences in executing large-scale projects give it an advantage. I mean, India could have could have been succeed because of its historical and geographical ties with Bangladesh. And but there's some issues, there are some strains has been created in over last 5 to 7 years, that especially the issues like border killing and the water sharing, as well as perceived interference in Bangladesh's politics. These issues actually has created a kind of strains in Bangladesh-India relations, and obviously the internal policies within inside India, that is perceived as anti-Muslim policies. All these things together, it has created a kind of anti-Indian sentiment in the country. I think these are the reasons that has restricted India's success a bit in the country. But definitely, I must say Bangladesh is still within the framework of India and China, India and the USA, but China is making substantial inroads in its infrastructure, especially its infrastructure, and obviously in defense as well. If I come back to the US's relations with Bangladesh, I don't think that US's policy has long been looking mainly at Pakistan and India, I think, because they're focusing more on India and Pakistan. They are not focusing on what other small states are doing. I think it is only after last 5 years, I think USA is now looking at engaging with the smaller states as well, and they have realized the importance of Bangladesh in the Indo-Pacific as a littoral state of the Bay of Bengal. So they invited Bangladesh to join the Quad, and definitely in the Indo-Pacific strategy. But Bangladesh did not join them officially because China has threatened Bangladesh that if we join there, it will damage our relations. So definitely we can understand that in this geopolitical situation, Bangladesh is not directly aligning with the USA at the moment, and this means when Bangladesh is why Bangladesh is not doing it, this silence in joining to the US's policy, it means a lot, because Bangladesh has been in that framework for a long period of time since its independence. So this is how, from that perspective, I think that China is likely to succeed to continue its investment in Bangladesh. Yeah.
Thanks, Shafi. And Gaurav, let me come to you with the same question on Nepal, but I did want to bring in an audience query as well, which I think relates to what we're talking about, which is that, in addition to kind of talking about the priority areas that Nepal is looking for assistance on, maybe also responding to, is Nepal looking at China kind of from the lens of over-promising and under-delivering? This is a question from Jonathan Dorsey. And he's asking, should countries trust that China is a reliable partner, or is it more about taking advantage of infrastructure projects and not really kind of looking into the trust factor as much?
Yeah, after the promulgation of Nepal's new constitution in 2015, the country has prioritized economic development as its #1 priority. And Nepal's stated foreign policy, one of the major guiding principles is that it follows the principles of non-alignment. Because being in a sensitive geopolitical environment sandwiched between two big and competing neighbors, India and China, so Nepal has always adopted maintaining good relations with all its neighbors. And now with the US, now it is engaging with Nepal lately through the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact, which is a $500 million infrastructure project, mainly in the roads and transmission lines, electrical transmission lines. And with India, 85% of our economic activity is with India. And there's no denying that India will, still keep that place because of the geographic proximity, cultural linkages, and socioeconomic linkages, linguistic affinity, and religious and even familial ties, people-to-people ties are more with India. And with China, although we have ancient relations with them, but the geographical complexity makes it difficult to have ease of access towards China. But having said that, China is also equally involved in Nepal, politically, economically, as well as in other domains also. But with the US, the rivalry plays out in Nepal, and as I've mentioned in my article also, the trilemma. Earlier it was with India and China. Now the US is also a big player, influential player in Nepal. So Nepal always needs to keep a balancing act among all these players. And as stated foreign policy goal, Nepal believes in not engaging in any military pacts or military initiatives. So that's why we have not been part of any military alliance, be it with the US or with China or with even with India. But bilateral military links have historically been with India also, with the US also, with China also. And so in that sense, Nepal believes in maintaining equal relations with all the countries for its economic development.
Thanks, Gaurav. Nilanthi, let me bring you in now, kind of keeping in mind the context of the discussion on the needs of the countries in the region. How do you feel the United States has responded, to some of these needs and actions that we mentioned, especially in the context of the fact that China has struggled a bit in the region in the last few years. We have seen that there was potentially space to utilize some of the concerns that countries were raising about cost overruns or corruption or debt traps or lack of local job creation with regard to China's Belt and Road Initiative. But as you mentioned as well, there isn't a mention of the smaller states in the Indo-Pacific strategy. It has been criticized for not having a hefty economic component. So how has the US sort of responded to some of these errors, shall we say, on the Chinese side?
It's a great question. I think for the first several years of BRI, that there was this sense that China is throwing hundreds of millions, billions of dollars toward these projects, and these countries, of course, have just an insatiable appetite for connectivity projects. Really, they're trying to meet their national development goals and really just jumping on that connectivity bandwagon, if you will. But I think we've seen now, 10 years later, and into this BRI branding, the shortfalls of that on the Chinese side. And then certainly the case of Sri Lanka, we've seen very tangibly in terms of China's overall lack of willingness to really help Sri Lanka where it most has desperately needed it in certainly over the past year. But I think in terms of a US response, one example that is quite clear has been the Development Finance Corporation, where if you look at the Trump administration's national security strategy, it was clearly outlined the need for the United States to modernize its development finance tools. So this was certainly a response to what the US and the world had been seeing with regard to BRI. And now under the Biden administration, this DFC has continued to be built out. And we've seen some projects, certainly by the DFC in Sri Lanka and Nepal. As Gaurav mentioned, the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact in Nepal, which was very controversial, but the government was able to pursue it through ratification, and certainly with a lot of U.S. diplomatic attention to that as well. More broadly, though, beyond these big projects, the U.S. is a significant enabler of trade. If you look at Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, the U.S. is the top export destination for these countries. And this is national income. This isn't money from remittances or money from loans. So I think the U.S. plays a role that doesn't quite get a lot of attention, but in terms of really enabling trade for these countries and enabling their exports, and also helping to boost these countries' foreign exchange reserves, which we see regularly in the headlines coming out of Bangladesh, but also with the economic crisis in Sri Lanka over the last year, how critical that is to have those reserves. And then generally, in terms of U.S. assistance, Bangladesh has been the largest recipient of U.S. assistance in Asia for 50 years, really, since independence. And then we've also seen U.S. crisis assistance to Sri Lanka over the past year with the economic crisis. But the U.S. also faces some challenges. For example, the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact, while it was successful from a U.S. perspective in Nepal, it was not in Sri Lanka. It was rejected. And then the Development Finance Corporation, it can't operate in Bangladesh because of concerns over labor rights and worker conditions, and the GSP suspension for Bangladesh. So that's an obstacle also for the U.S. to actually carry out some projects through the DFC in a significant country in South Asia. And there's also just broader structural challenges that these countries are facing now that Nepal has moved up from low income to lower middle income. According to the World Bank, all of these smaller South Asian countries are now at least at the lower middle income level of growth and development. But we have seen 3 of these countries go to the IMF in the past year. So there's a larger context of the effects of COVID and global inflation, and as Kithmina mentioned, just some self-inflicted wounds by Sri Lanka's mismanagement of its economy. So the U.S. is facing a lot of challenges, I think.
Thank you so much for that, Nilanthi. Kalpit, let me bring you in and ask kind of that question from the Indian point of view. India was one of the first sort of countries to register opposition to the Belt and Road Initiative. But there hasn't been much of a response or kind of alternatives provided by India in the region. And I think the other thing to point out here, and a question I'll take from Elizabeth Relkel, the director of our South Asia program at Stimson, who asked, have there been any lessons learned by India on how it's perceived in the region? There is, as Shafi was mentioning, concerns about interference in domestic politics. India's sort of seen, or has in the past at least seen, as a big brother in the region. How has India sort of tackled some of that to have a more kind of development and positive focus, interaction and involvement in the region?
So I think to start with, I think, the Indian position on BRI has been a little more nuanced. India had an issue with CPEC basically because of, typically because of the sovereignty issue, because, it was being built on, it is built on land which, the Indian Parliament, there's a parliamentary resolution that says that India needs to really reacquire that, that land. I'm not going into that dispute, but the second point really was also about debt sustainability, because, right from the time when, BRI came into existence, there was this whole issue of debt sustainability, that many of these countries were being saddled with a lot of debt. Now, I think, India also worked with China in terms of AIIB, where we were a part of it. So I think India has a very nuanced approach towards development. Now, having said that, where did BRI really score? I mean, we have to look at where BRI really scored. BRI scored where there are millions of people. We take things for granted. And I mean, I sit in a room which is well lit. I'm in this discussion because we have good, excellent broadband internet services. I think there's a huge population that lacks all these basic infrastructure facilities, and I think this is where China scored, and which is why India's pleas really they were like Cassandra's pleas that this was probably going to happen to you. There was a lot of debt sustainability. So I think there were these issues. But having said that, I think India has learned its lessons. I mean, I don't want to get into this. This is a little contentious issue regarding interference in each other's internal affairs. But I think the point is that India has also been a first responder, like we've discussed earlier, as a first responder to disaster, and I think we've learned our lessons.
Thanks, Kalpit. I'll want to take a couple more audience questions as we are in about our final kind of segment here. And Gaurav, let me come to you. This is a question from Krishna Sharma Podel, and he asks, does Nepal's foreign policy towards China change as the Maoist Communist Party heads the government in Nepal?
Well, I don't think so much, because Nepal, as we all know, that it's a multi-party democracy, and even communist parties, they participate in elections. So they are in power by winning certain number of seats. Although the Nepali Congress Party is the largest party at the moment in the parliament, but the Maoist party, its leader Pushpakamal Dahal Prachanda, with the support of the Nepali Congress, is the prime minister at the moment. So Nepali communist parties, they are used to participating in the multi-party democratic process since 1990. So in that sense, and even in earlier after 1950, also during the first democratic phase. So the Nepali communist parties, they are used to participating in the democratic process. So I don't think there's any question of a particular party being influenced by a particular party in another country to that extent that it affects the whole polity in Nepal. Thank you.
Thanks, Gaurav. We have a couple of questions here in the chat on the string of pearls kind of moniker and way of looking at the region. So maybe to Kalpit and Nilanti, where the string of pearls sort of seen as from the Indian point of view, the surrounding of the subcontinent and the waters around it with Chinese maritime BRI projects in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. Is that still a useful way to look at a Chinese engagement and involvement in the region? Is that a narrative? Is that more of hyperbole? One of our panel attendees, Zol Trembesky, asked, or is it is it still kind of useful to use that frame to talk about involvement of China and different countries in the region? Nilanti, to you first.
Sure, it's a good question. I think it's one lens. It's not the only lens. It's certainly when we're thinking about the string of pearls concept, and you look at the history, the evolution of it, it really emerges among analysts from India and analysts from the United States engaging and having these conversations. So at the heart of it is really India and its conception of its neighborhood and the countries that surround it. And also thinking about what countries are potentially their relationships with China could be threatening. The China-Pakistan relationship is well known and well understood. But at the time, around the 2004 or 5 period, people were really starting to understand, what does this mean if China develops deeper relations with the smaller countries of South Asia? And also it included Southeast Asia for that matter. So it wasn't even limited to a purely South Asian conception of potential potential threats for India. But then this China lens, it's essentially we're talking about major power lenses looking at the smaller South Asian countries, whether it's India's neighborhood, an Indian lens, or China's string of pearls. I think there's increasingly an evolution toward thinking about the region through the lenses of smaller South Asian countries and trying to provide more agency and understanding about how each of these countries are viewing these dynamics. And also I would add that India-China dynamic, that really points to Asia, but countries like Maldives, where I was recently, I was really, one of my impressions was just the reminder of the role of Saudi Arabia in Maldives, and just thinking about other countries that have really important relationships with smaller South Asian countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia for Maldives, whether it's Japan for Sri Lanka, Japan for Bangladesh. So I think it's important to understand that particular lens of the string of pearls discussion, but also to think about from the perspectives of smaller South Asian countries and how they need a range of options. It can't just be limited to India or China, and really just thinking about the potential partners out there that can really help some of these countries meet their national priorities and goals.
Thanks for that, Nilanthi. And our conversation hasn't focused on this so much, but of course, Japan and Australia are involved in the region as well with their own, aid and infrastructure development initiatives as well. But Kalpit, to you, same question: does the string of pearls frame or lens still have resonance in India? And what are some of the, concerns or threats that poses for Delhi?
See, I think let's try to understand one thing. See, China has increased its presence at particularly nations, which have ports. It's Hambantota is an example. I mean, I can, there are a lot of statistics on this, but I think it's also primarily because there is a great deal of anxiety in China that it has to kind of bypass the Malacca dilemma. There is a fear that its economic interest, its fuel supplies could be kind of throttled when ships travel through the Malacca Straits, and I think this is what impels China to take a very, very different kind of it impels China to really go in for this expansion. I think really the fear is that yes, there is some amount of fear because let's face it, look at the Riam look at the Riam base that that China established. See, there is a fear that a lot of the civilian infrastructure that is being built can then be used for purely military purposes. So I think that really poses a threat to not just India but to again these host nations too.
Thanks so much, Kalpit. Let me bring in one more audience question again, maybe on sort of the lenses that we use to look at the region. And there's a question from Munzima Haq who talks about hedging as a lens in international relations and how that applies to the region. And let me take this question to Shafi and Kitmina. How much does the concept of hedging between the US and China, for example, apply, or between India and China apply in the instance of both of these countries, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh? But also, another thought that has come in from our Q&A as well is, how much are countries in the region learning from each other's interactions with great powers, right? So has Bangladesh actually learned from the lessons that, for example, Sri Lanka has taken away from its engagement with China and the US, or vice versa? So let me come to you first, Kitmina, and then to Shafi.
Sure. I think, I can't speak for what the current Sri Lankan government is thinking, or kind of what Sri Lankan governments in general think. But I think in terms of the lessons learned, hedging has generally not worked because it has been, the governments have tried to hedge between one or the other. And we saw this, I mean, in my first article for SAV, I said Sri Lanka was pursuing strategic promiscuity, right? So to try and, open itself up to investment from one and then balance it out in investment in another area, in a different part of the country, etc. But now kind of the president is a forced agnostic, is what I called it, because the room for maneuvering is severely limited because of the economic conditions in the country. Now, the reason for that is that over time, Sri Lankan governments have realized that they cannot hedge with one over the other, particularly with the India-China dynamic. Because when you lean on, let's say, India for political support, you need China for economic support. And if you try to lean too heavily on China for political support and economic support, purely like Mahinda Rajapaksa's government did, then you have kind of the security dynamic and other political factors play kind of at the HRC and so on with India, and as well as the economy. So hedging has generally not worked for Sri Lankan governments. Over time, mostly Sri Lankan stated foreign policy has been non-aligned, but that also the governments haven't necessarily followed it. I think what would really work is a truly neutral foreign policy where it has proactive engagements with all these parties, but remains neutral on some of these contentious issues and does not kind of take part in the power politics between the two the players. But whether that is possible, I think is the kind of the big question. Right now, Sri Lanka doesn't have an option but to kind of stay neutral because it cannot afford to sully the relationship with one party over the other. How long that will take place once the debt restructure kicks in and kind of we move beyond debt, I think that's to be seen. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kutmina. Nilinti, you wanted to add a point on this before we go to Shafi?
No, let Shafi go ahead. That's fine.
Okay. Actually, yes, Bangladesh, she has rightly mentioned that Bangladesh is desperately looking for money. And this is very clear from Prime Minister's speeches, Foreign Minister's speeches. Recently, they came back from Belgium, and they managed $1 billion, and they have publicized it. They have managed money. So organizing money, taking money from outside, that's the only thing Bangladesh government is looking at because of its forex reserve is depleting every day. So yes, but the thing is, the things 5 years before were different. But now, as US is closely looking at the development in Bangladesh, especially looking at the elections to be held in 2024, and already a series of things has happened between Bangladesh and US. Already US sanctioned one of the security forces, the RAB, also implemented visa restrictions. Those were undermining the democratic process. So all these things keeping together, you cannot say that hedging is not working for Bangladesh at the moment. The scenario has changed completely because of US's direct engagement in the region now. So and I think USA has taken very it sounds a bit awkward in international politics, the ideological stance, but I think USA has taken very much an ideological stance for the South Asia, so promoting democracy and the human rights. So from that perspective, yes, Bangladesh is desperately looking at money. Yes, Bangladesh is still working within the framework of USA. Bangladesh, of course, is depending on USA because of it is the highest export country, and then obviously Bangladesh, the amount of money Bangladesh needs in the upcoming days, especially after 2024, and that amount of money cannot be sourced from other sources apart from the China. This is the one thing. I think that's why Bangladesh is depending more on China rather than to other countries. So that is why that concept of hazing in the current situation, in the geopolitical situation, it will not be working for Bangladesh. Yeah.
Akriti, just to jump in there, I think with the question from the professor from Bangladesh, it speaks to international relations theory. And I think there are some limitations when we think about hedging exclusively. And I wrote an article for the Small States and Territories Journal where I put forth a view where I think we can't only think about hedging and just at the international system level of analysis. We need to think about the smaller South Asian countries and their domestic interests and imperatives and preferences, and where those meet the domestic and the international systemic level, because India is such a dominant country strategically in this region and in the minds of leaders. So that's essentially an article that tries to put forth a view of how some of the smaller South Asian countries operate. And I think there are some limitations when we're thinking purely about hedging.
Thanks, Nilanthi. And I'm glad you mentioned, domestic politics, and Shafi, you mentioned elections, because I do want to sort of end our webinar on this more of a forward-looking note and thinking about how some of the kind of local dynamics impact at foreign policy, for example. So we are looking at elections in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, and the United States in 2024. How are domestic politics likely to shape some of these, geopolitical interactions in South Asia in the next few years, keeping in mind, potential change of government in any of these countries in 2024? Will some of the trends that we have seen or discussed here today, will they reverse or remain the same? Let me maybe start with Shafi, then go to Kitmana, then Kalpit, and end with Nilanthi.
Okay. While it is challenging to predict specific outcomes, the trends in South Asia's geopolitical dynamics will be influenced by the interplay of influenced by the interplay of domestic politics, regional alliances, and global power shifts. I think the 2024 elections in Bangladesh will indeed be a significant factor in shaping the country's foreign policy direction, as US promoting democracy and the human rights, and on the other hand, China and Russia is defending, to some extent, I would say, the sitting hybrid regime in Bangladesh. So definitely, this 2024 election will have its foreign policy direction implication.
Kitmana?
I mean, domestic political considerations has been the most dominant factor that has influenced Sri Lankan foreign policy and kind of its interactions, whether it's the war, whether it's economic crisis, and so on. But in terms of the presidential election and the parliamentary election that will follow, I don't think it's going to necessarily change the Sri Lanka's relationships with China and India significantly, because all the main parties involved kind of recognize that they need to have good relations with China and India and not align itself too heavily with one or the other. So I think that's that lesson has been learned. Well, Sri Lankan policymakers don't necessarily kind of implement lessons learned, but hopefully I think moving forward it will. But I think what is likely to, what concerns me with the upcoming elections is how that will impact the economic reforms, or whether we will kind of slide back to the sort of populist economic policies close to an election or right after an election that kind of undercuts a lot of the reforms that are trying to take place, and as a result then makes the domestic dynamics too vulnerable, and then that affects foreign policy. But speaking of presidential elections, I think the election that actually that I'll be keeping an eye on is the US election. And that is going to, I think, play a very important role in Sri Lanka, as well as I'm sure other countries in the region as well. Because, and we saw this play out, for example, when Trump was president, when Mike Pompeo visited Colombo, he pretty much said, you're either with us or against us, right? Now that stance hasn't been the same after Biden came in. But if, for example, Trump becomes president again and kind of follows the anti-China foreign policy that we saw continues or elevates it, then small states like Sri Lanka will be forced to make choices that will not be in their best interest, but also kind of, and I think that will then potentially affect the dynamic, because then the regional politics and the regional dynamics will also change from what it is right now. So I think in terms of domestic elections, I would say that the American election is more likely to change the dynamics than the local Sri Lankan election.
Okay. Quick word to Kalpit, and then we'll end with Nilanthi.
Yeah. See, I think, Akriti, let's understand, domestic politics and geopolitics, it's almost like an iterative loop. So now I say that because, the organization that I represent, ORF, we conduct a yearly poll where we speak to a lot of youngsters, regarding India's foreign policy, how they perceive India's foreign policy, what is their outlook. And I think we have to remember one thing, that this is a poll that we undertake every year. So I think if you see the kind of responses to the perception of China, there is a great deal of 2020 Galwan is really that watershed moment, where since then all polls have said that it's about 85% of India's youth really look at China as India's #1 challenge. And all this has happened only post the violent clashes between Indian and Chinese troops in Galwan. And I think if you speak to a broad kind of a constituency in India, you will find that there is one area where the government's policy is of greater troop deployments, of building infrastructure in border regions, has got a great deal of public approbation. So I think this is what I'll leave it at that.
Nilanthi.
Sure. To add another country to the mix, Maldives. On my recent trip there, it was interesting to me to hear just how many people volunteered that the role of foreign policy was the major factor in determining the election outcome. Of course, there were certainly domestic factors at play in Maldivians choosing their president, but many just offer the fact that this was a first for Maldives, certainly with this prominent India Out campaign. So it's anecdotal, but that's one thing that stood out. Another thing was just this elevated nationalism, not only regarding the India-China dynamics that we've talked about today, but many people in Maldives also brought up the Maldives legal case against Mauritius and demarcating the maritime boundary in the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, the ILO's decision earlier this year. So that sense of Maldives needing to defend its sovereignty and its territory, whether on land or on its maritime borders and resources, that was palpable.
A word on U.S. elections, maybe, Nilanthi. We are over time, but I would like you to say a word maybe on that.
U.S. elections, yeah, that's your guess is as good as mine. But I think it has been interesting, though, to see both the Trump administration national security strategy and the Biden administration national security strategy. There is a lot of continuity with regard to the threat perceptions of China and the need to really pursue alternatives to what China's offering, like with the Development Finance Corporation. So I'm really struck by some of the continuity across administrations.
Well, thank you so much to everyone for staying a bit over time with us. This has been a very, very interesting discussion, and I would encourage everyone who's joining to please check out the South Asian Voices series that this discussion is based on. It's available on www.southasianvoices.org. The video of this discussion, as well as the transcript, will be available from the Stimson Center on our website as well as on the SAB website. But I want to thank you all, especially to my panelists for joining us, and see you at another one of these discussions in the future.